Hello, it's David Leroy here, and in this slide presentation I'm going to be talking about a topic that has been of interest to me for most of my professional career, and that is the dynamics of repeated interviews with child witnesses in legal contexts. By way of some introductory comments about this slide presentation, I intend to begin by briefly outlining the controversy and differing opinions about repeated interviews that are held by professionals. I'm also going to interweave some examples of key pieces of research that have helped to shape our thinking, as well as draw on my experiences as an expert witness and share some examples from cases that I've worked on that have had repeated interviews in them. I want to conclude by looking to the future and sharing some ideas that have developed over the years about issues I think still need to be more fully considered. So what's the controversy about repeated interviews? What do people mean when they say repeated interviews? What's generally meant by the expression repeated interviewing is a situation where a child has made a disclosure or done or said something that's caused grown-ups around them to suspect possible abuse. The child is then formally interviewed, often by police, about their memory for the events of interest, and they're interviewed about their memory for the events of interest on more than one occasion. Thereby, they experience repeated interviews. Now, the very idea that children are asked to participate in repeated interviews has divided professional opinion over the years. Some commentators are quick to emphasize the emotional harm that repeated interviews might cause, having seen in their own professional experience children becoming distressed when they're talking about their abuse experiences, especially when they've been asked to do that more than once. And professionals have concerns about the possibility of re-victimization. Those focused on the quality of evidence also point to the possibility that repeated interviews might cause a loss of spontaneity, or a flatness of expression that's deemed to signal a lack of credibility regarding the allegations that a child might be making. Moreover, inconsistencies between interviews would routinely be capitalized on by competent defense lawyers and experts as evidence that we don't know what to believe. And this is particularly important in cases where a child's been interviewed a couple of different times and they've said slightly different things on each occasion. Well, which version is likely to be true? And strong legal arguments can be based around that premises. Psychologists have also provided evidence that the idea of repeated interviews is incompatible with what we know about suggestibility and forgetting. Given these concerns, it's not surprising that most interviewing guidelines around the world emphasize the one interview rule and encourage interviewers to be done in one. Despite there being done in one expectations, the reality is that children are frequently participating in repeated interviews about suspected abuse experiences for a whole variety of reasons. And I want to share some examples from some cases that I've worked on that illustrate the dynamics of repeated interviews with children in legal contexts. So let's first address concerns that repeated interviews are suggestive and that repeated interviews can exacerbate suggestibility. Concerns around suggestibility in repeated interviews have arisen from a wealth of studies that form a very robust literature on children's suggestibility. Take, for example, a typical study of repeated interviews. And this one's conducted by Maggie Bruck and her collaborators. In this study, 16 4.5-year-old children were interviewed about false events across a series of repeated interviews. For example, they may have been asked to tell about someone stealing food from their daycare centre. The interviews were devised to be highly suggestive, with the interviewers using a combination of increasingly suggestive techniques in an effort to get children to assent to untrue information. And not just that, but to also provide their own narrative about what happened. Bruck and colleagues obtained high rates of assents to false information, illustrating the risks of suggestive repeated interviews. How does research like that inform real-world practice? It seems that research like this is informative, particularly in cases such as the infamous McMartin case that occurred in the 1980s, where repeated interviews combined with suggestive techniques provided a pathway for investigators to obtain what are largely now believed to have been untrue allegations about abuse. Is this research generalizable and helpful today? Does research like this help us in cases where children have been repeatedly interviewed? And are highly suggestive interviews a thing of the past? I think it's fair to say that egregious interviewing is a lot less commonplace given what we know today about suggestibility. But given that interviewers know that it is not considered good practice to use suggestibility in interviews, when it is used today, you will sometimes see attempts to cover up the suggestive influence. So consider this case example. I was contacted by lawyers and asked to look at 2 interviews conducted with 2 young boys. One was 6 years old and one was 8 years old. The police seemed to have followed the rules in the interviews, but there were some features that caught my attention. First, the boys were making some very fantastic allegations, and they indicated in the interview that they'd been to the police and others and talked to them about the abuse. And it became clear that repeated interviews had probably been occurring. These earlier interviews were very difficult to obtain and required many months of legal pressure in order for them to be released to experts. It was finally revealed that over the previous year the boys had been interviewed initially by therapists before being ultimately interviewed by the police. And I wanted to check whether any factors in the repeated interviews might have contributed to the creation of untrue allegations, so I began inspecting the interviews. And I started to see plenty of evidence of suggestive influence. For example, that therapists did not rely on commonly recommended interview procedures, but instead deployed techniques that are known to be suggestive. For example, they inquired about dreams that the boys had been having. They gave them toys to play with, dolls. They asked many suggestive questions, and over the course of the interviews we see a snowballing of allegations. Initially, there were no allegations made by the boys, but by the end of the battery of suggestive interviews, allegations included having to go to school naked. The boys claimed they were made to wander around in a desert without their clothes on. They said they had been forced to eat excrement, that they had been anally raped, physically abused, and they made many more allegations like this about abuse. And you might think that cases like this could be quite straightforward given the amount of research that's been conducted on suggestibility and how informed we are today about suggestive practices. But I actually find cases like this to be incredibly difficult to work on. And so here are some of the challenges that you might face. By the very nature of cases that involve repeated interviews, they become very complicated to analyze. I recommend examining them in chronological order, but you need to do an enormous amount of back-checking while you're reading across repeated interviews. For example, as new allegations are made in later interviews, you need to check back through all of the previous interviews to see if the allegation itself was initially a suggestion by the interviewer, or whether the allegation is something that has arisen from the child without any suggestive influence. And this is incredibly time-consuming. It leads to very lengthy and detailed expert witness reports that look and feel quite pedantic and picky. It's difficult to criticize interviewers, but it's also difficult to understand attempts to hide suggestive interviews and then to watch people try and defend suggestive practices so vigorously. It seems that given what we know about suggestibility research, that it should be obvious that there were problems with the interviews, but the prosecution tried to pick off individual studies that I was introducing to imply that they didn't quite apply to the specifics of the current case. For example, if the research used a slightly different time delay, then that would be deemed to not really apply to the specifics of the current case. There was a general reluctance, I felt, for folk to accept the big picture, and the big ideas that we've learnt from suggestibility research really point to the conclusion that there's a high risk of contamination when children are questioned in suggestive contexts, and that across repeated interviews that suggestibility can become exacerbated. When I was testifying, I was also asked questions along the lines of, well, the allegations must have come from somewhere. How could these boys be making it all up? Are you saying that the boys are lying? So what's clear from suggestibility research is that, children probably aren't lying. They're falling foul of the suggestive practices used by interviewers. And there's something quite insidious about the way suggestibility works. Children who fall foul of suggestive tactics are not simply confirming a detailed account provided by the interviewer. They're being given clues and guidance and encouragement by the interviewer for them to create their own unique untrue accounts. So where does all the untrue information come from? Well, the truth is that the scaffolding for untrue accounts is all around us. All children need to do is adapt stories and things that they already know about. For example, in one of the interviews, one boy said that they'd been watching movies based on children's books, Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And I know these movies and books because my children read them too. The books chronicle the trials, tribulations and growing pains of a young boy. He gets into trouble, he lies, suffers misfortunes, plays pranks on people. He has a friend in the story that smells bad, and they start rumors that he walks around the neighborhood without his clothes on. There are incidents involving getting dog poop stuck on them. A boy loses his swimming trunks at the swimming pool and has to spend the whole day without them on and avoid being caught naked. Any of the information like that could be adapted to please interviewers and altered to make it look like they were part of allegations of abuse. Indeed, in the famous McMartin case, adults came forward many years later and explained, or tried to explain, how they were able to come up with such fantastic allegations of abuse when they were just little. And one former alleged victim told investigative journalists that they just imagined their family church with the altar and stained glass windows, and then used that in the descriptions to supply accounts of satanic abuse that the interviewers were seeking. So what about cases where there aren't so many concerns about suggestibility, but rather there are concerns about lengthy recall delays and the possible effects of memory delay? What does research tell us about the effects of repeated interviewing after long delays? Salmon and Pipe conducted a study of 4 and 5-year-old children's memory for a well child health assessment. In this study, the children would go to the doctor for their checkup And then afterwards they would be questioned by researchers about specifically what they remembered about that medical checkup. The children were interviewed shortly after the event or the medical checkup, and then they were interviewed again 1 year later. And crucially, the contents of these interviews was examined in great detail, and it was revealed that across the recall delay, when non-suggestive interviews were conducted, and there were important changes in the accounts that the children were able to provide. At the 1 year delay, the reports provided by children contained lots of completely new information, and this new information was only about 50% accurate. The researchers were able to tell that the children were able to recall new details about their health check, but they also introduced lots of new errors. So even when there are pretty good quality interviews conducted, there seem to be concerns when they are conducted with very long delays. And this central finding about the impact of recall delay has been replicated in several other studies and is frequently helpful in legal contexts. In this example, a 4-year-old girl was interviewed about suspected abuse. The interview was low quality, and the interviewers hadn't used recommended open prompts. The questioning of this young child was mostly leading, and the interviewers were only able to get her to repeat her initial allegation within the interview. So she wasn't able to provide much more information than she had when people first suspected abuse and heard her disclose or say something that caused suspicion. 9 months of preparation on both sides of this legal case led to it coming into the courtroom. Immediately before the trial, the defense was told by the prosecution that their expert had said that the interviews were not problematic. On the day of the trial, bizarrely, the expert reconsidered their view and agreed my report. So the expert changed their mind and agreed that there were some problems with this initial interview. So it looked like a case of a single interview that wasn't good enough for legal purposes, and that often in these situations, cases would be dismissed and not progressed any further. But in this particular case, the prosecution changed tact and suggested that they could just ditch the first interview and instead simply allow live testimony and cross-examination. And so my role instantly changed from having been one where I'd written a report that showed the shortcomings of an interview conducted 9 months earlier to now having to testify as to whether a repeated interview live in court would be an appropriate thing to do. Are there any risks involved in doing this? Yes, there are risks. Long delays can be very problematic because they offer opportunities for coaching, and as I've already said, over long delays, mistakes in recall can arise. I don't believe that repeated interviews are an appropriate fix for an earlier interview that was conducted of low quality. I also think, given what we know about the effects of memory delay, it's unlikely and that repeated interviews in this situation are going to be of any benefit. And in fact, putting a very young child into a courtroom situation and requiring them to recall events that have occurred a long time ago will be very cognitively demanding, and it's my experience that this is quite an unkind thing to do to young children. So we've looked at some circumstances in which repeated interviews are problematic, but what are some contexts where repeated interviews might be beneficial? Problems with repeated interviews could be avoided if interviews are conducted non-suggestively and when they are conducted after shorter delays rather than having long recall delays involved. So what does the research say? There are many cognitive psychology studies where people have been asked to recall word lists multiple times. And these studies show that it is a normal memory process, the normal workings of memory, for people to recall and recover new pieces of information every time they're given an opportunity to remember the list of words. So I decided to look in applied research that I conducted for my PhD at this very issue. I wanted to know what the dynamics of repeated interviews are and whether there were some conditions that repeated interviews may be beneficial as indicated or hinted at by the cognitive psychology literature. So I conducted a series of studies that examined both the effects of repeated interviews at various recall delays. The research was conducted in schools with children who had visited a friendly pirate. They engaged with the pirate and performed a number of fun activities that lasted for about 15 minutes. And after their participation in the event, they were repeatedly interviewed about what they could remember. And we interviewed them at different time delays. So what we discovered is that the accuracy of new reminisced information varied as a function of the delay between the repeated interviews. And as in previous research, when there were long delays between interviews, the accuracy for new information that was provided in the repeated interviews was very low. And this is due to forgetting as well as the introduction of memory errors over time. But when the recall conditions were more optimal, the accuracy of new information provided was very high. In fact, in one of our studies, the new information that was recalled was 92% accurate. And this accuracy rate for the reminisced information has also been found in studies with adults. Hope, Gabbett, Fisher, and Jamison, and Gilbert and Fisher have provided high estimates of the accuracy of newly reminisced information in similar conditions. Over the years, I've come to realize that this type of research, which is analog, applied, and experimental, while very interesting, still isn't robust enough to be directly applied to real cases in the capacity of an expert witness. There's some limitations about this type of psychological research that fact finders and juries would be really cautious about. Most notably, that in these studies the interviews are identical, so children come back to the interview context and they're asked exactly the same questions. Also, most of the psychological research on memory is conducted on non-abused children, so the relevance of this type of research to children who have been victims of child abuse isn't clear enough for most professionals. Also, the focus of the phenomenon on reminiscence in these studies differs from real-world repeated interviews that are really undertaken simply to get the cognitive benefits that are available. Often there's other practical reasons for the conducting of repeated interviews that aren't the same as the reasons that are used in the experimental and applied research. So to address some of these concerns, I've also wanted to look quite closely at real cases and the dynamics of repeated interviews that we see there, and I've published some case studies that illustrate the benefits or potential benefits of repeated interviews. And a technique that I use in real cases to analyze the production of information is to create interview composites. And I just got a couple of slides that I want to show you here, showing you how I might be able to do this. So if you take an interview transcript, it will normally have questions and answers, questions by the interviewer and answers by the child, and each interlocutor will take turns. And here you can see a passage of a transcript where a child has been asked closed and focused questions. So the interviewer says, do you or do you not play with your doggy? No. She plays with you, doesn't she? Yeah. Does she lick you? Maybe. Your mum said her name was Molly, is that right? Yes, the child says. Do you play with her outside? Yes. How many times do you play with her? 100 times. So you can see an interviewer has been asking questions and the child has been providing an answer. And these questions that we're looking at now are closed and focused questions. Here is part of an interview where open prompts have been used, and you can see the same child now able to provide a bit more of a narrative. The interviewer is asking open prompts. Tell me what happened. Tell me everything. I like to play with my doggy. Tell me everything about playing with your doggy. She plays with me and licks me. Tell me more. Because she likes to. Tell me more. Her name's Molly. Tell me everything about playing with her. She likes to play with me outside. Then what happens? She goes away and plays with my sisters. And you can see there the interviewer is using open prompts that are input free and allowing the child to produce information that they think is relevant. Now we can turn the information in these slides or from these parts of the interview into composites, and this gives us an insight into exactly what it is the child is telling us without the influence of the interviewer. And to do that, we would take the passages of transcript that we're interested in and simply delete what the interviewer has said. And when we do that in these examples, we end up with two different looking narratives. The first one that came from the open prompts reads like a little self-contained story or narrative. There's a sense to it. I like to play with my doggy. She plays with me and licks me because she likes to. Her name's Molly. She likes to play with me outside. And she goes away and then she plays with my sisters. So that holds together and we can get a sense of what the child's talking about without needing to look at what the interviewer is saying. And by contrast, if we were to look at the information that we got from the closed and focused questions, and if we were to take out the input from the interviewer, we're only left with no, yes, maybe, yes, yes, 100 times. And that doesn't make any sense on its own. So you can see there how just making a few composites can really help the testimony of the child sort of pop out and become a lot clearer, and it's much more compelling and powerful when it comes from open prompts rather than closed and focused questions. Well, we can apply this technique to analyzing repeated interviews. So this is a case study that we published in 2010. And what we did is we took an example from a transcript. We deleted what the interviewer was saying, and we looked in the first interview and we were able to make a composite that contained this information here. The child was able to say, on Saturday they were playing in the street, it was dark, there was no one there except for one guy, and he was playing with his hair, looking at me. He continued walking, I didn't see him. He asked me if so-and-so family was living there. So I said that I don't know, shook my head. I saw him playing with his fingers. He got closer and knocked me in the mailboxes. Now we were able to go through the second interview and find the information that the child was repeating, as well as information that the child had provided that was new. And we can add that into the composite here, and you can see in the bold font where we've added it, there are some extra pieces of information that help enhance the coherence of that child's account. So they're able to add in, for example, a little bit more information about when it occurred, about being followed. He was walking, but then he stopped. And more information about the alleged attack. I was far away from the mailboxes, so he catched my body like this and threw me into the mailboxes. And she's able to give the interviewers a much clearer indication of what happened in the second interview. So, done in one. It looks like there are both problems with conducting repeated interviews, but there are also some clear benefits of conducting repeated interviews, especially when those interviews are conducted with short time delays between the interviews, and when interviewers follow good interview procedures that recommend open prompts be used in the interviews. And I think the research is robust enough now that we can better defend repeated interviews in a much more nuanced way when it becomes an issue within legal context, particularly in court cases. It also is worth thinking about, as we look to the future, whether repeated interviews might actually be used more proactively in investigations. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a couple of slides. Just for your reference, I have based my knowledge in part on the research of quite a number of other people. Here is a bibliography of studies that you may be interested in reading. These are all field studies, so all of these studies involve the repeated interviews of children who are alleging suspected child abuse. So they are highly ecologically valid pieces of research, and they've all come out in the last 10 years or so. Other things to think about is the difference between repeated interviews. What do we actually mean when we use the term repeated interview, and what do other people think we mean? So a repeated interview could be an opportunity to just tell the interviewer again about the exact same thing that you are alleging. And that would facilitate some of the cognitive benefits that we see across repeated interviews. But repeated interviews within professional practice could also amount to extended forensic interviews, where the problem might seem too big that investigators decide in advance, look, we're just going to have to break this up into a few sessions just in order for the child to be able to cope with the amount of information that we're going to require. Sometimes repeated interviews are more like follow-up interviews. The child might provide an account in the interview. The investigators take that information. They may interview some other witnesses. They may make an arrest, discover some new information, and they might need to come back and follow up or conduct a second interview just to clarify additional pieces of information or evidence that they've obtained through the investigation. So for those of you interested in the topic of repeated interviews, there is more questions. Some of these may be answered within the literature already. Others might just occur to you when you're reading, but I think that they're all things to address in the future, and certainly things that we should be thinking about. In particular, what children exactly would benefit from repeated interviews? Is there some type of case characteristic, for example, that might lead us to think, you know what, this case in particular would be one where repeated interviews would be quite a good idea? We still need to learn more of the risks and benefits of repeated interviews. We don't know what the optimal number of repeated interviews might be for children. We have some information about age in repeated interviews, and it would appear that age isn't such a great factor, but it still might be the case that in practice younger children might benefit more from additional opportunities to recall information than older children. And it would also be interesting to look at issues around the identity of the interviewer. Should the same interviewer be conducting repeated interviews or a different interviewer altogether? Also, what are the long-term effects of repeated interviews? If they are memory enhancing, there's a good chance that they help form stronger memory traces, and it may be that moving forward across the lifespan, the effect of repeated interviews is one that makes it more difficult for people to forget these experiences than they otherwise would. I would just like to end by thanking my collaborators and people that I've worked with over the years. I've benefited enormously from conversations and ideas from this group of people that have very much helped shape my thinking and pushed my ideas. And I'm very grateful